One quiet morning at Phoenix Airport, a TSA officer laughed and called a woman's military badge fake in front of everyone. Passengers started watching. Phones came out. It looked like another embarrassing airport incident. But across the checkpoint, a U.S. Marine suddenly froze. His canine had already noticed something no one else did. Because that badge wasn't fake. And the quiet woman standing there wasn't who they thought she was. Within minutes, the entire terminal would realize they had just humiliated someone who once saved Marines on a battlefield. Morning sunlight spilled across the glass walls of Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, turning the vast terminal into a sea of pale gold and restless movement. The security line moved slowly, a long ribbon of tired travelers inching forward beneath the steady hum of fluorescent lights and rolling suitcases. Business people checked watches, families wrangled sleepy children. Somewhere above them, an announcement echoed across the terminal about boarding groups and delayed departures. Standing quietly near the middle of the line was Rachel Donovan, a woman who looked ordinary enough to disappear into any crowd. She was 38 years old, a little taller than most women around her, about 5'9", with a lean, athletic frame that suggested years of physical discipline rather than gym vanity. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a simple low knot, practical rather than fashionable, and streaks of faint silver had begun to appear near her temples. Her skin carried the sun-weathered tone of someone who had spent long periods outdoors, and a thin, pale scar ran along the inside of her left wrist, half hidden beneath the sleeve of her gray jacket. Rachel wore dark jeans, worn hiking boots, and a lightweight jacket that had clearly seen years of use. Over one shoulder hung a faded olive-green backpack, its fabric softened by time and travel. Nothing about her clothing drew attention. Nothing about her posture seemed aggressive or nervous. And yet, Rachel Donovan was not behaving like most travelers. While others stared at their phones or sighed impatiently, Rachel's eyes moved quietly through the terminal. She watched the reflections in the polished floor. She noted the position of exits. She noticed the rhythm of security officers directing passengers forward. It was not paranoia. It was habit. One formed in places where noticing the wrong thing too late could cost lives. Rachel did not think of herself as paranoid. She thought of herself as careful. Ahead of her, a TSA agent waved another passenger forward toward the scanner. The line advanced by 3 slow steps. Rachel followed, adjusting the strap of her backpack. The weight inside it was familiar, comforting in a strange way, though she knew very well how unusual its contents might look to someone seeing them for the first time. When her turn arrived, she placed the backpack into a gray plastic bin and slid it onto the conveyor belt. Her hands moved with quiet confidence. No hesitation. No attempt to hide anything. The bag disappeared into the X-ray scanner. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the conveyor belt stopped with a mechanical click. Behind the monitor sat Officer Miguel Torres, a young TSA screening operator in his late 20s. Torres had the slightly tired eyes of someone who worked too many early morning shifts. He had broad shoulders beneath his blue uniform shirt, and a neatly trimmed mustache that he adjusted nervously whenever something unexpected appeared on his screen. Right now, something definitely had. Torres leaned closer to the monitor. Clusters of dense metallic shapes filled the image. Tightly packed objects arranged with mechanical precision. Cylinders, injectors, metal clips, coiled tubing. Not random items tossed into a travel bag. Organized equipment. He raised a hand toward the supervisor standing nearby. "Bag check," Torres said. Stepping forward was Officer Brian Keller, the senior TSA supervisor overseeing that lane. Keller was a man in his early 50s, with a thick neck and a face that had weathered years of airport stress and endless complaints from travelers. His once black hair had faded into iron gray, cropped short in a practical military-style cut that hinted at a past career he rarely discussed. A permanent crease lived between his eyebrows, carved there by decades of suspicion and impatience. Keller believed strongly in rules. More accurately, he believed strongly that people who questioned rules usually had something to hide. He walked to the inspection table and motioned for Rachel to step forward. "Ma'am, this your bag?" Rachel nodded once. "Yes." Her voice was calm, steady, neither defensive nor apologetic. Keller pulled the backpack toward him and began unzipping it. The zipper moved halfway before Rachel spoke. "Sir," she said evenly, "there's medical equipment in there." Keller paused, looking up at her properly for the first time. Rachel met his eyes without hostility, but without submission either. "I'm not refusing inspection," she added quietly. "I just appreciate someone familiar with medical gear present while you handle it." The request itself was reasonable. The tone was respectful. But Keller heard something else entirely. He heard conditions. His jaw tightened. "You're telling us how to do security now?" he said, loud enough that a few nearby passengers glanced over. Rachel did not react. "I'm asking for careful handling," she replied. Behind Keller, Officer Torres watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Travelers slowed their steps, sensing the beginning of a scene. Keller shook his head with a dry laugh. "Everybody's an expert these days," he muttered. He pulled the zipper open completely. The inside of the bag revealed a layout so precise it almost looked surgical. Elastic straps held equipment in tight rows: tourniquets, compact airway tubes, sealed syringes, trauma shears, and vacuum-packed medical dressings. Every piece had its place. Every pocket had a purpose. Torres leaned closer. "That's serious gear," he said quietly. Keller scoffed. "Or someone playing soldier." He reached deeper into the bag, shifting equipment aside until his hand closed around something heavier. When he pulled it out, a small cloth pouch slipped open and spilled its contents onto the metal table. A worn metallic badge slid forward with a faint scraping sound. The badge was not polished or ceremonial. Its edges were dull, scratched from use rather than display. The engraved insignia, a stylized eagle above a medical cross, was unfamiliar to most civilians. Torres picked it up between two fingers. "Look at this," he said with a crooked smile. Keller glanced at it briefly. "Let me guess," he said. "Another war hero." A couple of travelers nearby chuckled awkwardly. Torres turned the badge over in the light. "You can buy these online now," he said. "Seen it before." Rachel did not reach for the badge. She simply stood there, hands resting loosely at her sides. Inside her chest, a familiar tension stirred. The quiet echo of memories she preferred to keep buried. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something closer to patience, learned the hard way. Storms passed faster when you didn't fight every drop of rain. Keller tapped the badge against the table. "So," he said, voice rising slightly for the benefit of the growing audience, "what unit is this supposed to be?" Rachel's eyes lowered briefly toward the badge. Her voice remained calm when she answered. "It was issued to me." Torres laughed. "Sure it was." Keller shook his head, already convinced he understood the situation. "Another fake hero story," he muttered. Around them, the airport continued its restless motion. But Rachel Donovan stood quietly beside the inspection table, watching the badge lying under fluorescent light. an object that had once meant something very different in a place far from Phoenix. And for the first time that morning, she wondered if the quiet trip she had planned was about to become something else entirely. The tension around the inspection table had begun to attract quiet attention from travelers moving through the Phoenix Sky Harbor security lanes, though most people still assumed it was just another routine bag check slowing down the morning rush. At the far end of the checkpoint, Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes stepped forward beside his canine partner. Daniel moved with the composed discipline that years of Marine service had carved into his body. At 36, he stood a little over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a lean, functional build shaped by training rather than vanity. His face was sharply defined, the jaw square and firm, with short, sandy brown hair cut close to the scalp in Marine fashion. A faint scar traced along his right eyebrow, a thin white line that hinted at the kind of accidents that happen during hard field exercises rather than comfortable office work. Daniel's beard was trimmed short and neat, just enough to soften his otherwise severe features. People who knew Daniel often described him as a quiet man, someone who spoke only when necessary. That habit had developed long before the Marines. When he was 23, during his first deployment overseas, his convoy had struck an improvised explosive device outside a small desert village. The blast killed the Marine sitting beside him and left Daniel with a permanent respect for silence and observation. Since then, he had trusted instinct more than noise, which was partly why he had later volunteered for the Marine Military Working Dog Program. Beside him walked Ranger, his canine partner, a 4-year-old German shepherd with deep amber-toned fur that darkened along his back like a shadow. Ranger was large for his breed, close to 90 pounds, his body built with the powerful proportions of a working dog bred for endurance and intelligence. His ears stood tall and alert, constantly rotating towards sound, and his eyes carried a calm focus that made strangers instinctively step aside when he passed. Unlike ordinary pets, Ranger moved with professional composure, trained to detect explosives, track threats, and read subtle human behavior. Normally, Ranger walked smoothly beside Daniel, matching his pace step for step without needing commands. But as they approached the security lanes that morning, Ranger suddenly slowed. His head lifted slightly. Then he stopped. Daniel felt the pause instantly through the leash. Ranger almost never stopped without a reason. "Easy," Daniel murmured quietly, giving a gentle guiding tug. The dog didn't move. Instead, Ranger stared across the checkpoint toward the inspection table where Rachel Donovan stood surrounded by TSA officers. His ears tilted forward, muscles tightening with focused attention. Daniel followed the direction of the dog's gaze. Across the open security area, he could see the small scene unfolding. A backpack spread open on the metal table, several officers leaning over it, and the woman standing calmly beside them while one of the agents laughed. Daniel noticed something immediately. The woman, Rachel, was not reacting the way most travelers did when questioned by security. Most people fidgeted, argued, or looked embarrassed. Rachel did none of that. Her shoulders remained relaxed. Her breathing appeared slow and controlled. Even the way she positioned her feet suggested balance rather than nervousness. It was the posture of someone accustomed to high-stress situations. Ranger took a step forward. Daniel allowed the leash to loosen slightly as they moved closer to the inspection area. The officers barely noticed the Marine approaching at first. Their attention remained on the items taken from Rachel's bag. When Daniel finally saw the table clearly, his eyes settled on the small metallic badge lying beneath the fluorescent lights. At first glance, it looked old and unimpressive. Its edges were worn and scratched, the metal dull from years of handling rather than display. But Daniel recognized the insignia immediately. A stylized eagle above a medical cross, and beneath it, a number etched along the lower rim. His expression hardened slightly. That was not a decorative badge or a souvenir. It belonged to a Marine Casualty Evacuation Team, a specialized group that operated alongside Marine infantry units during the later years of the Afghanistan conflict. Daniel had never served with them directly, but Marines talked about those teams with a certain respect. They were the ones who flew into dangerous areas to retrieve wounded soldiers when evacuation helicopters could not land safely. Daniel remembered one particular briefing years earlier when an officer described those teams simply as the people who show up when everything else has failed. The TSA agent holding the badge tossed it lightly in his palm with a smirk. "Nice fake badge," the man said to his coworker. Another officer chuckled. "You can order stuff like this online now." Daniel's gaze shifted from the badge to Rachel. She stood quietly beside the table, hands resting loosely at her sides. Her dark hair remained tied back, her expression calm but distant, as if she had learned long ago that explaining herself rarely changed people's assumptions. Ranger walked forward without waiting for a command. Daniel watched carefully, but didn't stop him. The dog approached Rachel slowly, nose lifting slightly as he caught her scent. For a moment, Ranger simply stood beside her leg, studying her with quiet concentration. Then he sat down. It was not the rigid sit of a detection alert. It was the relaxed, attentive sit he used when Daniel introduced him to trusted personnel during training. Rachel looked down at the dog with mild surprise. "Well, hello," she said softly. Her voice carried an instinctive warmth toward animals, the tone of someone who respected working dogs rather than treating them like pets. Ranger's tail tapped once against the floor. Daniel felt a flicker of confusion. Ranger had been trained to remain neutral around strangers unless given permission to interact. Yet here he was, calmly sitting beside a woman under investigation, as though he recognized something about her. Daniel stepped forward now, drawing the attention of the TSA officers. One of them glanced up. "Sir, we're handling an inspection here," he said. Daniel nodded politely, his posture relaxed but authoritative. "I understand." His voice was quiet but firm, the tone of someone used to disciplined environments where people listened before speaking. His eyes moved back to the badge on the table. Rachel noticed the direction of his gaze. For a brief moment their eyes met. Daniel saw something there. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe only cautious curiosity. The TSA agent lifted the badge again and held it toward Daniel. "You military?" the officer asked. Daniel gave a short nod. "Marine Corps." The officer smirked slightly. "Ever seen one of these before?" Daniel studied the insignia for another moment. Yes, he had seen it before. And suddenly the laughter around the table felt completely out of place. Because Ranger was still sitting beside Rachel Donovan, calm and unmoving, like a loyal guard who had already decided exactly where he belonged. And Daniel Hayes had the uneasy feeling that the people standing around this table had no idea what kind of story they had just stepped into. The murmur of travelers grew louder around the inspection lane, though the tension at the metal table had begun to draw a quiet circle of curiosity from nearby passengers. People slowed their steps just enough to watch without appearing obvious. Phones hovered at chest level. Some travelers whispered to each other, guessing at what kind of trouble the calm woman beside the table might be in. Rachel Donovan stood exactly where she had been asked to stand. The fluorescent light above the inspection area reflected faintly across the brushed metal surface of the table and the scattered medical tools from her backpack. Tourniquets, sealed syringes, and trauma dressings lay arranged in the careful order that Officer Keller's search had disrupted. Rachel's expression remained steady, though inside she could feel the slow tightening of memory and patience that often came when strangers misunderstood things they had never seen before. She had learned years ago that arguing rarely helped. Sometimes silence was simply easier. Across from her, Officer Brian Keller crossed his arms with visible impatience. Keller was the kind of man who believed strongly in structure. His thick neck and squared shoulders gave him the appearance of someone who had once spent years in disciplined environments, possibly law enforcement or military service, but who now carried that same rigid authority into airport security work. His short gray hair framed a face that had grown accustomed to suspicion rather than curiosity. Keller disliked uncertainty, and the woman standing quietly in front of him, refusing to explain herself beyond calm answers, made him deeply uncomfortable. "So," Keller said, tapping the old metallic badge against the table again, "you're telling me all this equipment belongs to some veterans program?" Rachel nodded slightly. "Yes." "That's a lot of equipment for a civilian flight," Keller replied, his tone sharpening. Rachel didn't react to the challenge. "It's part of a medical support network," she said evenly. "We transport emergency trauma kits for veterans who need them." The explanation sounded reasonable, but Keller's expression did not soften. Instead, he glanced toward another TSA officer standing behind him. "Call airport police," Keller said. "We're verifying identification." Rachel exhaled slowly, not a sigh of frustration, just a measured breath that steadied her thoughts. She had dealt with worse misunderstandings in places where there were no airport lights, no security cameras, and no rules to rely on. Compared to those memories, this situation felt almost ordinary. Beside her leg, Ranger remained seated like a quiet statue. The German shepherd's amber-toned fur caught the light as he watched the officers carefully. His ears twitched at every shift of voice or movement. Though Ranger was trained to follow Daniel's commands above all else, something about Rachel's presence seemed to hold his attention with unusual focus. A few feet away stood Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes, still watching the scene unfold. Daniel's arms rested loosely at his sides, but his mind was working quickly. He had seen many confrontations during his years in uniform. Arguments, confusion, even panic. But the woman standing beside the inspection table was not behaving like someone caught in a lie. She wasn't defending herself. She wasn't raising her voice. Instead, she stood with the quiet composure of someone accustomed to being questioned by people who outranked her. Daniel noticed the rhythm of her breathing again. Slow, controlled. It was the breathing pattern taught in Marine field training to stabilize heart rate during high-stress situations. His suspicion deepened. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He stepped a few paces away from the inspection table before dialing a number from memory. The call connected after 2 rings. "Hayes," came the voice on the other end. The man speaking was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Alvarez, a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton, the sprawling Marine Corps base along the California coast. Alvarez was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with a thick black beard and a booming voice that carried the confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades commanding Marines in difficult places. Years earlier, Alvarez had been Daniel's squad leader during a training rotation, and the two had remained in occasional contact since then. Daniel kept his voice low. "Gunny, quick question." "What's going on?" Alvarez replied. Daniel glanced toward the inspection table. Rachel still stood there, the TSA officers circling around her like investigators trying to prove a theory. "I'm at Phoenix Airport," Daniel said. "TSA just pulled a badge out of a woman's bag." "What kind of badge?" Daniel described the insignia carefully. The eagle crest, the medical cross, the number etched along the rim. For a moment, the line went silent. Daniel could almost picture Alvarez leaning back in his chair, rubbing his beard while thinking. When Alvarez finally spoke again, his tone had changed. "Where'd you say you were?" "Phoenix Sky Harbor." Another pause. "You sure about the markings?" "Positive," Daniel replied. The silence on the other end stretched longer this time. Finally, Alvarez exhaled slowly. "Daniel," he said quietly, "if that badge is real, that's not something a civilian just carries around." Daniel's eyes drifted toward Rachel again. She hadn't moved. The airport police had not yet arrived, but Keller was already gathering paperwork as though the situation were settled. "What do you want me to do?" Daniel asked. Alvarez answered with a calm seriousness that immediately sharpened Daniel's focus. "First thing," the gunnery sergeant said, "don't assume anything." Daniel nodded slightly, even though Alvarez couldn't see him. "But if that badge is genuine," Alvarez continued, "it belonged to a team that worked some ugly missions overseas." Daniel already suspected as much. He waited. Alvarez's voice dropped lower. "Those evacuation teams pulled Marines out of places most units wouldn't even enter," he said. "People who wore that badge didn't talk about it much." Daniel felt a faint chill run through his thoughts. He looked again at the woman standing beside Ranger. Rachel Donovan still appeared calm, but something in her eyes had shifted. Perhaps she sensed the direction Daniel's suspicions were moving. Perhaps she simply recognized the way Marines observed people who shared the same battlefield habits. Alvarez spoke again on the phone. "Daniel." "Yes, Gunny?" "If that badge is real," Alvarez said carefully, "don't let them keep it." Daniel ended the call slowly. The weight of the conversation settled into his mind as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Across the inspection table, Officer Keller was still speaking with the other TSA agents, clearly confident that the situation would end with paperwork and another delayed traveler. But Daniel Hayes now had the uneasy feeling that the small piece of metal lying on that table represented something far larger than anyone around them realized. And as Ranger continued sitting quietly beside Rachel Donovan, like a loyal guard who had already chosen his side, Daniel began to understand that whatever story stood behind that worn badge, it had not yet been told. The noise of the terminal softened gradually, as if the airport itself sensed something shifting inside the security checkpoint. About 15 minutes after Daniel Hayes ended his call with Gunnery Sergeant Alvarez, the casual curiosity surrounding the inspection table began to change into a quieter, heavier attention. Conversations lowered. A few TSA agents glanced toward the main corridor leading into the checkpoint. Even Officer Keller, who had spent the last several minutes filling out paperwork and speaking with airport police, seemed to pause, as if something had unsettled his confidence. Rachel Donovan remained where she had been standing since the beginning of the inspection. Her posture had not changed. One hand rested lightly near the strap of her backpack, while the other hung relaxed at her side. Inside, however, she could feel a familiar tension beginning to build, the kind that came whenever events moved beyond her control. Across from her, Ranger still sat quietly beside her leg, his amber eyes watchful but calm. Daniel Hayes stood a few feet away, arms folded loosely across his chest, though his mind remained alert. Marines learned to recognize subtle shifts in atmosphere long before anyone else noticed them. The first sign arrived not with a sound, but with movement. 3 figures entered the security area from the far end of the terminal corridor. They were not running, and they were not loud, but the purposeful way they moved caused several travelers to step aside instinctively. Authority had a strange way of announcing itself without words. Leading the group was a tall Marine officer whose uniform alone carried enough presence to quiet the nearby TSA agents. Colonel Thomas Mercer was a man in his early 50s with the commanding posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform. Mercer stood just under 6'2", his shoulders broad and straight beneath the dark green Marine service coat. His hair had turned nearly silver with age, trimmed short and neat, while a deep vertical crease between his eyebrows gave his face a permanent expression of concentration. His jawline was sharp, clean-shaven, and his eyes carried the steady composure of a man who had led Marines through difficult situations without ever raising his voice. Mercer had spent much of his career overseeing medical evacuation coordination during overseas operations, and the habit of measured calm had followed him long after the battlefield. Walking beside him was another Marine officer, Major Linda Carver, a woman in her early 40s with a lean, disciplined build and a quiet intensity that seemed to follow every step she took. Carver's dark hair was pulled tightly into a regulation bun at the back of her head, and her olive-toned skin and sharp cheekbones gave her a striking, focused appearance. Years earlier, she had served as a logistics officer, coordinating emergency extraction teams in conflict zones. Those experiences had shaped her into someone who valued efficiency above all else. She rarely spoke more than necessary, but when she did, people listened carefully. The third member of the group stood slightly apart from the two Marines. Jonathan Pierce, a civilian representative from the Department of Defense, wore a dark gray suit rather than a uniform. Pierce was in his mid-40s, slender and composed, with neatly combed black hair and thin-framed glasses that gave him the appearance of a university professor rather than a government official. Yet the calm precision in his movements suggested years of working in high-level security environments. Pierce specialized in coordinating sensitive personnel matters between civilian agencies and military command structures. Together, the three approached the inspection table with quiet certainty. Officer Keller noticed them immediately and straightened his posture. The presence of two high-ranking Marines inside the security lane was unusual enough to trigger concern. "Can I help you?" Keller asked cautiously. Colonel Mercer didn't answer right away. His gaze had already settled on the metal table where Rachel's equipment remained scattered. The colonel stepped closer, examining the items with careful attention before his eyes stopped on the worn metallic badge lying near the edge of the table. Mercer reached forward and picked it up. The room seemed to hold its breath. He turned the badge slowly between his fingers, studying the worn edges and the engraved markings. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly off the dull metal surface. After only a few seconds, Mercer gave a small nod. "This badge is authentic," he said calmly. The words fell across the checkpoint like a stone into still water. Officer Keller blinked, clearly caught off guard. "That can't be right," he said quickly. "We believe the passenger might be impersonating military personnel." Major Carver's eyes moved toward Rachel. For a brief moment, she studied the woman standing beside Ranger with quiet recognition. Then she gave Rachel a small, respectful nod, the kind one professional offered another without needing explanation. Mercer turned back toward Keller. "She's not impersonating anyone," the colonel said. The surrounding officers exchanged uncertain glances. Keller shifted uncomfortably. "Then who exactly is she?" The colonel looked back toward Rachel Donovan. For a moment, something softer appeared in his otherwise disciplined expression. "Staff Sergeant Rachel Donovan," Mercer said evenly. "Former United States Marine Corps combat medic." Silence spread across the inspection area. Rachel lowered her eyes slightly, as though uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Several years earlier, Rachel Donovan had served with one of the Marine casualty evacuation teams operating in Afghanistan. Those units specialized in retrieving wounded Marines from areas where standard medical evacuation helicopters could not safely land. The work had required extraordinary courage and discipline, often carried out under dangerous conditions. During one particularly difficult mission, Rachel had been injured while assisting in the extraction of several wounded Marines from a remote valley under hostile fire. The injuries had ended her military career, forcing her to leave the service earlier than she had planned. But leaving the Marines had not meant leaving the mission. After months of rehabilitation, Rachel had joined a nonprofit medical network that provided emergency trauma kits and field support for veterans suffering from long-term combat injuries. The equipment inside her backpack was part of that program. Colonel Mercer placed the badge back gently on the table. Ms. Donovan is currently traveling under authorization to assist with a medical consultation for veteran trauma programs, he said. Officer Keller's confident demeanor had faded into visible uncertainty. I wasn't aware of that, he admitted. Daniel Hayes watched the exchange from a few feet away. The confirmation from Mercer settled the doubts that had been forming in his mind since the moment he recognized the insignia. Beside Rachel, Ranger remained seated, his calm posture unchanged. Rachel finally spoke again, her voice quiet. "It's all right," she said. "They were doing their job." Mercer nodded once in acknowledgement. The officers began carefully repacking Rachel's medical equipment exactly as it had been arranged before the inspection. Around them, the watching travelers slowly returned to their own business, though the story unfolding in the checkpoint had already left its mark on the room. And as the last item disappeared back into Rachel Donovan's worn olive backpack, one truth had become unmistakably clear. The woman they had mistaken for a suspicious traveler was in fact someone who had once risked her life saving Marines on a battlefield thousands of miles away. The tension that had hovered over the Phoenix Sky Harbor security checkpoint slowly dissolved into the usual rhythm of airport life. Rolling suitcases moved again across polished floors. Boarding announcements echoed from distant speakers. Travelers who had paused to watch the unexpected confrontation began drifting back toward their gates, carrying with them quiet pieces of a story they would probably tell later that evening. At the inspection table, Officer Keller and the other TSA agents worked more carefully now. The same hands that had earlier scattered the contents of Rachel Donovan's backpack were now methodically placing each item back into its original position. Vacuum-sealed trauma dressings slid back into elastic straps. A compact airway kit was tucked into the side pocket where it had originally rested. The tourniquets were rolled and secured again with the precise discipline of equipment designed for emergencies rather than display. Rachel watched them without resentment. The calm expression on her face had not changed since the moment Colonel Mercer confirmed her identity. If anything, the tension around her shoulders seemed to have faded slightly. Officer Keller finally zipped the backpack closed and handed it toward her. His earlier confidence had softened into something more thoughtful. "Ma'am," he said, clearing his throat awkwardly. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Rachel accepted the bag with a small nod. "You were doing your job," she replied simply. Her voice held no accusation. That, more than any reprimand could have, seemed to unsettle Keller. He nodded again and stepped aside, allowing her to move forward. Nearby, Colonel Mercer and Major Carver had already begun speaking quietly with Jonathan Pierce from the Department of Defense. Their conversation was brief and professional. After confirming Rachel's travel clearance, the three of them left the checkpoint with the same quiet authority they had entered with, disappearing into the steady flow of the terminal. Rachel adjusted the strap of her backpack over her shoulder and walked toward the gate area. The morning sunlight streamed through the high windows of the terminal, casting long reflections across the floor as passengers hurried between departure boards and coffee stands. For the first time since the inspection began, Rachel allowed herself a slow breath. She had never enjoyed being the center of attention. The Marines had taught her many things: discipline, resilience, loyalty. But perhaps the most enduring lesson was that the best work was often the work no one noticed. A few gates down the concourse, a familiar pair approached. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes walked with the same quiet stride Rachel had noticed earlier. His posture remained upright and composed, the controlled presence of someone trained to assess situations before reacting. Beside him padded Ranger, his amber-toned fur catching the warm morning light from the terminal windows. Ranger noticed Rachel first. The German shepherd's ears perked, and his tail gave a single slow wag as he approached her. Up close, Ranger looked even larger than he had from a distance, broad-chested, powerful, yet moving with the calm grace of a highly trained working dog. His eyes carried that familiar intelligence unique to dogs who had spent years working beside soldiers rather than living in ordinary homes. Rachel crouched slightly and ran her hand along the side of Ranger's neck. "Good boy," she murmured. The dog leaned gently into the touch, clearly comfortable with the quiet affection. Daniel stopped a few steps away. "Looks like he decided he likes you," Daniel said. Rachel smiled faintly as she stood again. "I've met a few working dogs before," she replied. Daniel studied her carefully for a moment. The details he had noticed earlier, the controlled breathing, the steady posture, the faint scars that spoke of old injuries, made more sense now that Colonel Mercer had confirmed her past. "I've heard stories about those evacuation teams," Daniel said after a moment. "Marines don't forget the people who pulled them out when things went bad." Rachel's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "Stories tend to get bigger with time," she said. Daniel shook his head gently. "Maybe," he replied, "but some of them are true." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Travelers passed around them, pulling wheeled luggage or balancing coffee cups while glancing up at the departure boards. The world continued moving in its usual rhythm, unaware of how unusual the morning's events had been. A boarding announcement echoed from the speakers overhead. "Flight 482 to Washington, D.C., now boarding at gate C14. Rachel glanced toward the gate display. That was her flight. She adjusted the strap of her backpack again and looked back at Daniel. "Looks like that's me," she said. Daniel nodded. "Safe travels." Rachel hesitated briefly before speaking again. "I appreciate you paying attention earlier," she said. "Not everyone would have." Daniel shrugged lightly. "Ranger noticed first," he said. Rachel looked down at the dog again, scratching behind his ear. "Good instincts," she said softly. Ranger's tail wagged once more. Rachel then turned and began walking toward the boarding line forming near the gate. She blended easily into the group of travelers waiting to scan their boarding passes, her worn olive backpack resting quietly against his shoulder, like it belonged there all along. Daniel watched her for a moment as she disappeared into the line of passengers moving down the jet bridge. Beside him, Ranger sat calmly on the polished airport floor. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quiet. "Some people carry the war with them," he said thoughtfully. Ranger lifted his head slightly, ears twitching. Daniel gave a faint smile and reached down to pat the dog's side. "And they don't talk about it," he finished. The boarding line moved forward, and Rachel Donovan stepped through the aircraft door just like any other passenger, starting another ordinary trip. Behind her, Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport returned completely to normal. But for the handful of people who had witnessed the events at the security checkpoint that morning, the memory remained clear. A reminder that sometimes the quietest people in the room had lived the loudest stories, and that the heroes who saved lives rarely looked like heroes at all. This story reminds us that sometimes the people who carry the greatest burdens walk quietly among us, unnoticed and uncelebrated. In a world that often judges quickly, moments like this feel almost like a small miracle, reminding us that God sees every sacrifice, even when others do not. The kindness, patience, and courage we show each day may seem small, but in God's hands, even the smallest act can change someone's life. In our daily lives, we pass hundreds of strangers without knowing the battles they have fought or the pain they carry. Today's story is a gentle reminder to look at people with compassion, because God often places extraordinary souls right beside us when we least expect it. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Let more people be reminded that quiet heroes still walk among us. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what part of this story stayed with you the most. Your words may encourage someone else reading them. And if you believe that stories of courage, faith, and kindness still matter in this world, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue sharing more stories like this together. May God bless you, protect your family, and bring peace and strength into your life wherever you are today.